The Hindu-American Paradox. Wealth Without Influence, written by Rakesh Krishnan Simha. Hindu Americans face a critical gap in institutional power. Despite their success, the absence of robust advocacy organizations leaves them vulnerable to political marginalization and cultural misrepresentation in an increasingly diverse America. In the heart of an upscale New York neighborhood, Drive S. Savadas and his wife, Prabha, names changed, have built a life of enviable success over the past 5 decades. A semi-retired physician, Savadas owns a portfolio of high-end properties spanning the United States and his ancestral homeland of Kerala, India. Financially unburdened, the Savadas family embodies the American dream, their story a testament to the opportunities afforded to diligent immigrants. While the couple identifies as Hindu and remains politically engaged, their religious involvement is largely nominal. Like many Hindu Americans, the Savadases offer minimal support to Hindu-specific causes. Unfortunately, they are hardly an exception. In fact, they exemplify the larger Hindu-American paradox. Despite being one of the most prosperous, well-educated, and professionally successful communities in the United States, Hindu Americans have largely failed to translate this success into institutional or political power. The community's substantial wealth has not given rise to a robust ecosystem of advocacy organizations, policy think tanks, or media voices to protect and promote Hindu cultural and religious interests. As America hurdles toward an increasingly competitive multicultural future, the glaring institutional void in the Hindu-American landscape poses urgent questions about identity, political relevance, and long-term security. A community of contrasts, while precise figures are difficult to determine. The Hindu-American population is estimated to be around 3 million, or approximately 1% of the U.S. population, making Hindu Dharma the nation's 4th largest faith. This demographic, predominantly of Indian descent, is a powerhouse of socioeconomic achievement. According to the Pew Research Center's 2024 data, Hindu Americans boast a median household income of approximately $126,000, surpassing other ethnic groups. Over 70% hold bachelor's degrees or higher, compared to the national average of 39%. They dominate fields like technology, medicine, and academia, with leaders at the helm of corporate giants like Microsoft, Google, Adobe, and Starbucks. In 2025, 11 Fortune 500 companies, with a combined market cap exceeding $6.5 trillion, are led by CEOs of Indian heritage, prompting former U.S. Ambassador to India Eric Garcetti to quip. The old joke was you could not become a CEO in the U.S. if you were Indian. Now the joke is you cannot become a CEO in America if you are not Indian. This economic clout translates into substantial contributions to politics and academia. Indeed, Hindu Americans donate generously across the political spectrum and to prestigious institutions like Harvard, Stanford, and MIT. Yet, despite their wealth and influence, they have not built strong advocacy organizations to represent their cultural, religious, or political interests. Where are the Hindu institutions? Compare the Hindu American community's institutional footprint with that of Jewish or Muslim Americans, and the gap is glaring. Jewish Americans, numbering around 8 million, boast a dense network of influential institutions, including the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, the American Jewish Committee, AJC, B'nai B'rith, and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. These groups not only preserve Jewish identity, but also wield considerable influence on public policy, media narratives, and interfaith dialogue. Even Muslim Americans, who are less affluent on average, have built formidable advocacy platforms. The Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, the Indian American Muslim Council, IMC, and American Muslim Health Professionals, AMHB, are just a few among many national organizations that provide legal aid, lobby for legislative change, and shape public discourse. CARE commands a $10 million budget and has a nationwide network. In contrast, Hindu Americans are primarily represented by a handful of national organizations. Hindu American Foundation, HAF, Coalition of Hindus of North America, COHNA, Hindu Action, and Hindu Pact. While they are deeply committed to protecting Hindu interests, these organizations operate with limited resources and reach. Their efforts in areas such as educational outreach and legal defense are commendable. Yet, their scale remains modest compared to similar groups in other communities. They have addressed issues such as textbook misrepresentation and temple vandalism, and one of them has only recently received a $1 million donation from a Houston-based businessman, a contribution considered a major event in the Hindu advocacy ecosystem. The fact that such a donation stands out so prominently underscores how far the ecosystem still has to go before it can take on adversaries like CARE. Cultural and historical roadblocks to advocacy, the Hindu community's organizational inertia is not accidental. Several cultural and structural factors have historically undermined its capacity to build institutional power. Focus on individual success. Hindu American culture often prioritizes individual achievement and professional success over collective action. Rooted in a historical context where education and economic mobility were pathways to stability for Indian immigrants, this focus has led to a community that excels in personal accomplishments but lacks a tradition of institutional organizing. The emphasis on individual meritocracy may discourage the allocation of resources toward collective advocacy. Fragmentation by region and language. The Hindu American community is diverse, encompassing individuals from various regions of India with distinct languages, traditions, and cultural practices. This diversity, while a strength, often hinders unified action, as regional and linguistic identities can take precedence over a shared Hindu identity. For instance, the large Gujarati, Punjabi, and Malayali groups in America rarely, if ever, coordinate their work towards a common cause. Unlike Muslim Americans, who often rally around a shared religious identity despite ethnic diversity, Hindu Americans struggle to coalesce around a singular advocacy agenda. Temple trap. Hindu Americans have invested heavily in constructing temples. According to the Pluralism Project at Harvard University, 20 years ago, there were 435 temples in America. Today, that number has increased to around 1,300, with larger and more opulent temples in the works. Interestingly, about 48% of Hindus in the U.S. make regular donations to religious institutions. As per a Pew Research Center report, Hindus are the largest contributors of donations to religious institutions among immigrants. No argument there. According to the treasurer of BAPS Swaminarayan, each of their temples receives an average of $20 million in donations. Temples undoubtedly have their place in the community, serving as cultural and spiritual centers. But their role is often limited to spiritual, social, and educational functions rather than political or advocacy work. While temples can be financially lucrative and provide tax benefits, they also serve as platforms for community leaders to gain visibility, potentially diverting resources from broader institutional development. This focus on temples reflects a preference for visible, tangible symbols of identity over less glamorous but more impactful advocacy organizations. Political naivety and transactional generosity. Hindu Americans are known for their generous political donations, yet these contributions rarely translate into sustained political influence. As former President Barack Obama humorously noted during a campaign speech, he loved Indian Americans because they make large campaign donations without asking for anything in return. He hit the bull's eye. Hindu immigrants merely seek photo opportunities with politicians rather than leveraging their financial support to demand policy concessions. This flippant and cavalier approach to political engagement limits their ability to cultivate long-term relationships with policymakers or shape legislative agendas. Turncoat politicians. Hindu politicians in the United States have repeatedly failed to stand up for Hindu causes. Despite being elected to powerful positions, figures like Pramila Jayapal, Ro Khanna, and Ami Bera have either ignored or actively opposed Hindu concerns. Jayapal has frequently aligned herself with narratives that vilify India and Hinduism under the guise of human rights. Ro Khanna has gone so far as to join anti-Hindu caucuses and support pro-Pakistani causes, undermining the very communities that helped elevate him. And Ami Bera, despite his heritage, has remained largely silent on issues affecting Hindus both domestically and abroad. Hindu politicians know the Hindu electorate is divided and distracted, so they have little incentive to champion Hindu causes. After all, if there's no political cost for ignoring the community, why stick their necks out? Perception of stability and security. The relative socioeconomic success of Hindu Americans may foster a sense of complacency, reducing the perceived need for advocacy organizations. Unlike communities that face economic marginalization, Hindu Americans may view their position as secure, underestimating the importance of institutional power in safeguarding their interests. Inaction has consequences. SB 403 in 2023, California's controversial SB 403, a bill to include caste as a protected category under anti-discrimination laws, became a lightning rod for Hindu Americans. The bill unfairly targeted Hindus by singling out caste, a complex social hierarchy historically associated with India. However, Hindu Americans lacked a centralized platform to coordinate opposition or present a unified stance. Instead, individual activists and small, loosely organized groups were left to navigate the complex legal and political landscape, resulting in fragmented and less effective responses. After all efforts failed, and it seemed like the bill would pass, it was left to individual Hindus to tackle the bill. Two prominent Indian American political fundraisers and community leaders leveraged their networks and experience to personally advocate with Governor Gavin Newsom, advising him that continued community support would, in part, depend on his decision to veto SB 403. While Newsom did veto the bill, the entire SB 403 episode highlighted a critical gap in Hindu American civic engagement. Incidentally, SB 403 was introduced by Aisha Wahab, the first Afghan American and Muslim elected to the California State Senate. It is illustrative of how our adversaries make full use of their power base to bring down Hindu identity and institutions. Risks of continued indifference, the absence of institutional advocacy, poses significant risks for Hindu Americans, particularly in a rapidly evolving socio-political landscape. Several potential consequences loom large. Political marginalization. Like other minority groups, particularly Muslim Americans, continue to build political power, Hindu Americans risk being sidelined in policy discussions. The growing influence of Muslim advocacy groups, combined with their strategic engagement with progressive and liberal coalitions, could lead to policies that inadvertently or deliberately marginalize Hindu interests, such as those related to India-U.S. relations or religious freedom. Vulnerability to legislative challenges. The California caste bill controversy highlights the vulnerability of Hindu Americans to targeted legislation. Without a unified advocacy platform, Hindu Americans struggle to counter narratives that portray Hinduism as inherently discriminatory or regressive. Similar legislative battles, whether related to immigration, religious freedom, or cultural representation, could further expose this weakness. Loss of cultural narrative control. Hindu Americans' significant donations to universities have not translated into influence over academic narratives about Hinduism or India. Instead, their funds often support programs critical of Indian culture or politics, such as post-colonial studies or South Asian studies departments that emphasize caste oppression or Hindu nationalism. Without think tanks or academic institutions to promote balanced perspectives, Hindu Americans risk losing control over their cultural narrative. The experience of the Hindu diaspora in Fiji should serve as a cautionary tale. During the colonial era, Hindus in Fiji, who were primarily indentured laborers, focused on economic advancement rather than institutional power building. By the 1980s, Hindus comprised over 50% of Fiji's population and achieved a historic milestone with the election of a Hindu prime minister. However, the lack of Hindu representation in key institutions like the military and police, both overwhelmingly dominated by native Fijians, enabled a military coup in 1987 that ousted the Hindu-led government. The resulting political instability and discrimination forced hundreds of thousands of Hindus to flee, reducing their population to less than 32% today. This historical precedent illustrates the dangers of prioritizing economic success over institutional power, a lesson that Hindu Americans must heed. With America's Hispanic population, currently 19.1%, projected to make up 26.9% by 2060, and with the African American and Muslim populations also set to increase substantially, a Hindu community lacking strong advocacy groups will be left out of the economic, social, and political sweepstakes. Way forward. From wealth to wisdom, if Hindu Americans are to avoid becoming a politically invisible, culturally misunderstood, and socially sidelined minority, the time for action is now. Build a flagship advocacy organization. The community needs a national, well-funded organization focused on civil rights, legal support, media advocacy, and policy lobbying, a Hindu American version of CARE or the ADL. This institution must be professionally managed, transparent, and inclusive of the diverse voices within the community. Invest in think tanks and academic chairs. Rather than mindlessly donating to elite universities, Hindu philanthropists must fund think tanks, research centers, and endowed chairs focused on Hindu studies, Indian philosophy, and global Hinduism. These entities can produce credible scholarship and challenge biased academic narratives. Develop political strategy and alliances. Engagement with political systems must move beyond photo ops. Hindu Americans need to cultivate long-term relationships with candidates. Join advisory councils and establish political action committees, PACs, that support lawmakers aligned with their values. Leverage temples for civic engagement. Temples can and should serve broader civic purposes: voter registration drives, community organizing, leadership training, and interfaith outreach. Their infrastructure and funding make them ideal platforms for such activities. Foster unity across regions and generations. Community forums, youth programs, and leadership development pipelines can help cultivate a pan-Hindu American identity that transcends regional and linguistic divisions. This shared identity is crucial for long-term institutional strength. Conclusion: Hindu Americans stand at a pivotal moment. Despite their status as top donors, Hindu Americans have limited influence over how Hinduism or Indian culture is portrayed in the media and academia. Instead, the endowments they support often support departments, like South Asian or post-colonial studies, that emphasize caste oppression or promote critiques of Hindu nationalism. Hindu voices are noticeably absent from shaping these narratives. Meanwhile, younger generations, increasingly exposed to negative portrayals of Hinduism in the American media and classrooms, may begin to distance themselves from their heritage in response. The question is no longer whether Hindu Americans can build institutions. Clearly, they can. The question is whether they will. Because if they don't, their future will not be defined by wealth and success, but by political marginalization, cultural misrepresentation, and missed opportunities.
As a result, many Hindu sampradayas struggle to be recognized as religious denominations under Article 26, not because they lack spiritual legitimacy, but because the lens through which they are judged is fundamentally misaligned with the lived realities of Hindu tradition.